I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. And we pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, past and present, as custodians of the world's oldest continuous living culture. My name's Larissa, and I'm the founder and director of the perinatal grief support charity Possum Portraits. To my left here is our wonderful expert panel, and I'll introduce them in a minute, and then they can say a little bit more about themselves. So we've gathered here today to learn about a new psychotherapeutic children's book, a new resource for grieving families, and to learn about this book and how to care for ourselves and others after loss. And then afterwards we'll be happy to take your questions in a Q&A. But first of all, I'd like us all to take a moment, because some of the things that are going to be said and heard today are going to be a bit hard to say in here. And so I'd like us all just to drop an anchor of resilience and of hope to give us the emotional resilience that we might need to go forward. So why don't we just all take half a minute to think of something that we're grateful for. Keep that in the back of our mind as we traverse this morning's conversation. Okay, let's begin. To my left, we have our wonderful Isabel Oderberg. She's a journalist, media professional, and author of a book that many of you will have heard of and maybe even read, Hard to Bear, The Science and Silence of Miscarriage. And she is also a bereaved mother. Izzy, would you like to say a few more things about yourself?
Thank you. So I have 2 living children. I had 7 losses on the way to having my 2 living children. They were all early pregnancy losses, so miscarriage and termination for medical reasons. And, you know, as a result of that, being a writer and a journalist, I was constantly being asked to write on the topic, and I made the decision to wait until my journey was over. And once my journey was over, I started doing the research and realised, oh no, it's not like an article or whatever, it's a book, and I never intended to write a book, so that was a surprise to me and everyone I knew. But I persisted and I wrote my book, and it's had an amazing reception. I think that, you know, miscarriage existing at a kind of a crossroads between 2 things that make everyone very uncomfortable, which is sort of bleeding and also you know, grief. Meant that it's been very ignored. It just hasn't been really addressed and unpacked, and the people who experience it often don't have support. I think in the case of later losses, it's more understood and it's more accepted as loss, I think. So I've now been working in this space for, you know, 3 or 4 years, and it's a huge privilege, and there's a lot of lived experience that is shared with me, which is really, really precious. And I was given an award as well later this year, which was a genuine shock. But RANZCOG gave me their 2024 Outstanding Contribution to Women's Health. So that was really special. And I'll continue to work in this space with the Early Pregnancy Loss Coalition, which I founded, and we together were able to get a huge win earlier this year, which was the first ever federal budget spend dedicated to miscarriage and miscarriage care. So that was just, you know, huge. So changing the world one step at a time, yes.
Thanks for being here, Izzy.
Thank you.
Next up, on Izzy's left, we have Nicole Hasseldine. She's the founder and owner of Isla Grief and Loss, which is a perinatal bereavement education business, and they work on capacitating frontline healthcare workers in the area of perinatal bereavement care. Would you like to say a little bit more about yourself, Nicole?
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so thank you for having me here today. So I'm Nicole. I'm a bereaved mum to our daughter Isla, who she passed away 8 years ago after a complicated birth. We spent a couple of days with her in NICU before we had to make a difficult decision. And yeah, I've ever since have been very passionate about bringing education about bereavement support to health professionals, and that became a business. And I work with Red Nose as well as a peer supporter, and co-facilitate one of their groups, face-to-face groups. And yeah, it's an area I just never thought I'll find myself on after Isla, but I'm really grateful for. Are we talking about grateful already?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm grateful to be amongst people who see a need in developing such a amazing resource now as well, because I mean I'm now in this club, as we always say, we don't want to be in. We meet so many bereaved families, and I had a living child at that point already as well. So I have 3 living boys and my daughter Isla hanging over us, and yeah, certainly faced a situation as well that we had my old boy at home, and yeah, I'm really grateful to be amongst people who developed such a great book, and yeah.
We're grateful to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's keep all the gratefulness coming today.
Yeah.
This is hard enough as it is. Next up we have Levita, Dr. Levita de Sousa. She's a counselling psychologist in private practice with the Centre for Perinatal Psychology, and she's also a lecturer and researcher at Monash University. Go.
All right, she's already said everything that I was going to, but I think what I might add here is my absolute passion for perinatal mental health and infant mental health. And so my research and my practice really looks at supporting parents and families through bereavement, but anything that can make the transition to subsequent pregnancies and subsequent just parenting somewhat easier. Larissa and I are working on a project currently where we're looking at parents who've used Larissa's portraits, and we're trying to see how what that experience was like for them, and whether or not it has helped in the integration of grief. So anything that will help parents talk about their grief and integrate it for them is where I feel very passionate and want to support parents with.
Fantastic. We also have one final panelist who's joining us remotely from Santa Fe in New Mexico in the United States. This is Dr. Corey Lee. Thanks so much for being here, Corey. It's the evening where she is, so she's done a full day's work already, so... Corey is a professor of thanatology, a grief counsellor, and a certified child life specialist, and she's also a bereaved mum. Welcome to say a few more things about yourself, Corey.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I guess I should say good morning to everyone over there. Yes, I'm also the author of 2 books, What Does Grief Feel Like?, a psychotherapeutic book for young kids, and a book called It Won't Ever Be the Same, which is for grieving teenagers, and I've spent about 20-ish years working mostly with grieving children and families. And it wasn't until about 4 years ago that I myself found myself a part of this club that nobody wants to be in. And my lived experience very much informs now my clinical work. And I am so blessed and lucky to have connected with Larissa on this incredible project.
Thanks so much. Corey is the author of the resource guide at the end of the book, The House in Ollie's Tummy, and we're really grateful that she collaborated with us on this project from so far away. So let's get into some questions for our panelists. So, Izzy, can you give us a picture of the incidence of pregnancy loss in Australia today? I mean, we're a first world nation, you know, among the top healthcare systems in OECD countries. How common is pregnancy loss these days?
So my sort of expertise is in early pregnancy loss, so that's under 20 weeks, and it affects about 150,000 families a year, so a higher rate than every 5 minutes. There's a miscarriage in Australia, and that strips out families who experience multiple miscarriage, recurrent loss. Beyond that, I believe that where a baby's born sleeping, I think the incidence is somewhere between 2 and 3,000, but please, anyone can correct me. Yeah, okay, cool. You know, it's so widespread, and I think that anyone who's experienced, especially early pregnancy loss, because it's I think flies more under the radar than babies born sleeping. I think that you know, the one thing that shocks everyone is that when you do start telling people, everyone says, "Oh, me too," or, oh, that happened to my sister, oh, that happened to my friend, that happened to my boss, that happened, you know. And it's only when you start talking about it that you realise really how common it is. But equally, just because something is common doesn't mean that we ignore it or dismiss it or, you know, are so bad at treating it or treating the things that, you know, the psychosocial issues around it. So, yeah, that's, yeah.
Can you, I mean, this seems like a ridiculous question, but can you tell us why losing a baby is difficult? I mean, parents face this question every day, don't they? Like when you confront somebody or when you share your loss with somebody and you get these sort of weird statements like, oh, you know, at least it was early, you know, whatever early means. You know, why is it hard to lose a baby? They weren't even born yet, you didn't know them. Nicole?
Well, I think that it starts with these whole, it's against the natural sort of birthing order. We're not supposed to bury our own children, and witnessing that or experiencing that is extremely difficult for anybody involved. And we have all these hopes and dreams by planning even our pregnancies, and then when we find out we fall pregnant, you know, it's meaningful from the beginning. We attach to the idea, and it just keeps growing. So anybody,
if you're a birthing person, it's growing in your body.
Yeah. So it's incredibly impactful from the very start for those many reasons.
Mm-hmm. And Levita, can you say a bit more about maybe the psychological and the emotional consequences that often face parents as a result of bereavement?
I think Nicole has summarized it really quite well. So when mum's transitioning to parenthood, what's also happening is she's organizing herself inside. So she's organizing her inner self, she's organizing her mind, she's doing all of those things. And fantasy also kicks in about what this infant's going to look like. And there's this whole plan about, you know, they're going to look like this, and they have a person, oh, they're kicking like this, and, you know, thinks this person could be a footballer, and it's just like my father. Like, you know, they have all these projections on their infant. And so when something like this happens as early, whatever early is, right? It's not just the loss of that baby. It's not the natural order of things, but it's having to grieve all of that internal processes that go along with it, and that's very hard because it's not real, right? But it is in the parent's mind. It's very real because those exact same processes is what's going to have bond with that baby, and so every mum has it, every dad has it. And we're starting to learn that about fathers as well. So. That's what makes it so hard, and that's what the consequences are, and they're often silent.
Yeah. Can I
It's never ending.
Absolutely.
add to that? So absolutely. So that process, it's called personification, and it happens due to sort of cultural issues that have encouraged parents to see, parents that have a wanted pregnancy, to see that pregnancy as a baby from a very early stage. So, you know, when you look at people who are doing, say, pregnancy announcements often at 12 weeks, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, they'll have shoes or a tiny little jacket with, you know, whatever. And they're the tools of personification. And not everyone has this, I have to add. Like, not everyone mourns a loss, but for those of us, which is a large number that do, you know, it is very difficult for someone who hasn't been in that position to understand, especially in a world where so many of us are pro-choice. There's a tension, and certainly for me, being pro-choice, I was like, well, how can I be, you know, pro-women or people with uteruses choosing to have an abortion if that is what they seek to do, but equally be mourning a baby at 8 weeks? Like, how do I marry these two together? And the answer is personification. The answer is the difference lies in me having already seen that. You know, medically, of course, to me personally, medically, it's not a baby at 8 weeks, right? It's a cluster of cells. But in my head, that cluster of cells, I've given that cluster of cells a name, their eye colour. I can picture them being a little brother, a little sister.
You're preparing
That's
to turn your
where
whole life
the tension
upside down.
is. And that's why when you can't see a baby, that's the difference between understanding the loss of sleeping babies and not understanding the loss of an early pregnancy loss, and that's why we fly under the radar in that sense. I hope does that help? I hope that
Yeah.
I just want to say, what I think makes it also very difficult is that society really puts a bit of a, you know, puts a norm to how we're supposed to grieve, full stop. And then
Yeah.
when we're taking pregnancy loss in there, like we're already getting told who we grieve and when and how long. And for us as bereaved parents, because this is a never-ending journey and we're getting re-triggered over the years over and over, you know, if you have any other children, or even you just see children, you know, your mind goes on and it's all these re-triggers going, but there's not a lot of compassion or understanding for us still
But
grieving.
also, can your grief stop making me uncomfortable,
Exactly.
please?
It
Oh,
is
yes.
You're
so
making me really
oh my
uncomfortable.
gosh,
Can you
yes.
stop?
Yes, it
you
is
know,
very
like
uncomfortable.
that
Yeah.
thing.
So
you know?
That's definitely,
still,
yeah.
because we don't talk enough about it, and I mean that's another question later on. But it
Yeah.
all it's all feeds into this why it's so difficult because we don't often, you know, we don't get the space still to.
On that note, Corey, you've written several books about grief, and you're also a professor of thanatology. How grief literate is our society? We obviously don't talk about it openly. Why do people struggle so much to voice this topic?
It's a good question. And I think that, you know, cross-culturally, we can look at the way that some cultures integrate the concept of grief and mourning, maybe slightly better than say, for instance, here in the United States, where we are. I like that term of grief literacy. One of the things that I talk about with the school districts that I work with is being a grief-informed school. And a part of that is really being able to say these words, to have these conversations. There's a really big movement here in the United States called the death positive movement, which we see that all over the world. People call it different things, but it's really trying to help and make what is in the shadows have some light on it, right? To have these conversations, to say the words dead, die, death, gone, grief, to talk openly, and to allow grief itself to be a witness, right? And to be witnessed. And I think we could probably have an entire day-long retreat summit just on this idea of grief literacy. But I think it also really starts with the individual and how comfortable or uncomfortable you are with talking about these things. And then particularly in my work, where I work a lot with children, you know, how comfortable or uncomfortable are you with saying these things in front of children, with children? So it really starts at that micro and then works out to the macro, the family, the community, the society itself.
And the children mirror the adults, don't they? If they see the adult is uncomfortable talking about this, they will think, oh, this is probably something that should make me uncomfortable, even though really when they're not primed like that, children tend to be quite sort of able to talk about these issues quite openly, don't they? Especially if you name them by what they are. Don't we have all these euphemisms, or, you know, the baby is gone, or the baby, you know, something that's very abstract for a child. So do children grieve differently, Levita?
Oh, absolutely. Children grieve very differently. I mean, they experience similar emotions, but the process of grieving can look quite different depending on the child and the age and stage of their development. So with the younger babies, you might see a little bit more unsettled behavior, and of course, or maybe regressions. With the older ones, you'll often, what I see in my practice anyway, is sometimes what I see as delayed grief. So they wait for the parents to finish grieving, and so often I will have parents coming a year and a half later going, but you know, when grandpa died, you know, at that time, this you know, little Johnny was so strong, and we just thought he was coping really well, and now he's not. It's like, well, what was happening a year and a half ago? Well, I was falling apart. So when you hear that, you go, well, they're waiting for mom and dad to sort of hold it together, and then they almost get permission to then fall apart then.
That's so powerful.
And I think in some ways for children experiencing bereavement loss, right, it's not just grieving the sibling if they are aware of it, but it's also grieving the parents they knew before the sibling was born, because suddenly mom and dad are not the same. And so I've not just lost this, which I may or may not be able to explain in words, but I've also lost this connection with my parents. It's feeling different, and I don't know what to do about this.
That's really powerful. That we have to remember that the family is a unit, and all the parts are dynamic and, you know, interrelated with each other. So, Corey, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about some families that you've worked with after loss, and say what sort of unique challenges do families with existing children face when a loss occurs?
Yeah, and absolutely. I think that idea of the family as a unit, and even using a visual like a stool, right? Like if a family is comprised of all of those different legs, and then one of them is taken away, it doesn't just magically stand up by itself, right? The weight has to be reconfigured. Sometimes you have to take the legs off and reposition them. You have to get a new top for it, right? So the way that families grieve, and I talk a lot about this when I'm working with couples that are in different grieving styles or having communication challenges, is that we're grieving together, but we're also grieving apart. And so trying to find the ability to integrate the apartness can be really challenging, especially when we have children are fundamentally grieving at a different level, in a different way than adults are.
What are sort of some of the behavioral issues that children might have? I mean, Livita already said one, delayed grief, when they're sort of, waiting for mum and dad to, get out of the acute phases. What else? What sort of other presentations of grief do children, might they commonly have?
Yeah, we oftentimes see, and just like she was saying, children are still feeling these emotions. They're just expressing them differently. And oftentimes it comes out in their behaviors. You will see it in their play. You'll see it in regressions. Say for instance, if a developmentally appropriate milestone has been met, like they're no longer in diapers or they're in a big kid bed and a big stressor happens in the family, it's quite often that you can see a bit of a developmental regression. Maybe, they're back to sleeping in the bed, or maybe they're back to, using diapers temporarily. You'll also see it in their play, themes of play, repetitive play. You'll see it in their emotions, but as we know, the emotional capacity for younger children versus adults is quite different. So the amount that it takes to fill up their cup is a lot less than it is for us. So we see things, I call them grief bursts. People call them different things, but they're quite intense experiences of emotion where you'll have like that overwhelming overpouring of emotion and then, okay, I want to go play.
Okay. And so it's as important really to have resources that are child appropriate and family appropriate to help grieving children or to help the family unit as a whole brave this situation. So on that note, let's jump into talking about The House in Ollie's Tummy, which is a resource that does exactly that. Livita, you wrote a book review for the Australian Counselling Association. Would you like to just summarise the plot of the book for us?
I would, yes. So I think it's a beautiful book. It's so simple. It's so it's made very complex concepts simple. It's not a simple book. What I really like is how grief moves in, and the way grief is described. It talks so beautifully about this unpredictable, almost uncontrollable, and sometimes unplanned nature of grief, right? Like it just pops up, like the grief bursts, and I don't know what to do with it. And the connection that Ollie then feels with his grief, the attempts he has at pushing the grief away and ignoring it and pretending it. So it talks about coping with grief, sometimes not very helpful ways of coping with grief, but then also talks about connecting with your grief, which you can then connect with your parents, and offers a great way of we can grieve together and we can grieve apart. And I find that concept the book has taken us to that concept really well.
Mm-hmm. Is the sort of you have children, when you say grief is sort of a word that kids don't really, it's not really in their vocabulary so much. They know sad. So in what sense do you think that this book can expand their idea of what grief is? Do you think that it's something that they can understand?
Well, I'd say two things here before I sort of directly answer the question, just to frame it. But the two most important sort of lessons that I had around grief and, my parenting, and also, I guess, the idea of how you help your children or children around you through grief. The first was a conversation with Bruce Pascoe, who some people might know, Aboriginal elder, and I asked him in a conversation that we were having about his book, which is not about grief. I said, at what age do you tell a child? We were talking actually about the stolen generations. Like, what age do you tell your children, because my children are Aboriginal, that these terrible things happened or whatever? the first lesson is what he told me, which is children are so much more resilient than we give them credit for, and we need to see that strength and be more honest with them. As soon as they're old enough to hear it, you tell them. That was his view. I'm not saying it's right for every child, but it got me thinking a lot about how much we try to protect children from things that we potentially should be talking to them about. The second lesson was that I was speaking to actually a grown woman who was talking about that her mother had losses when she was a child. And so she was looking back on those losses. And her mother was visibly pregnant, and then one day she wasn't. And her mother experienced significant mental health issues following that loss, which we can only assume was a stillbirth. It was because she was very large in this person's memory, and it was never discussed. It was just silence. And one day she was pregnant, and I'm going to have a sister or a brother, and it's amazing, and the next day she wasn't. And she's still traumatised. She's in her 40s. She still has never talked to her mother about it because her mother just doesn't want to. And she still carries enormous trauma from that period of her life. And so the two things combined to me, and so with that in mind, I was always very open with my children. But sometimes when you are experiencing grief, you need help. It's not easy. Your head is, not where it would, not in a state that it would not normally be in, if I can say it like that. Often you're cloudy, you're tired, you can't, and I know I need to do this, but I just need help. And this is what I see the book doing for families like mine, is it gives me a really clear starting point that is compassionate but also honest. I love analogy and metaphor. I'm a writer, like that's my bread and butter, okay? But equally, I think there are times when you actually just need to say what's happening. And I think that the book combines those things really, really well, in the sense of potentially it gives an imagery, both in words and pictures that children can understand the theme and the idea. But it also is fairly honest about what the language is, I don't like the way that we say passed away instead of died. I think that at some point we have to be honest that there are things in life that we're all going to have to deal with in some way, and I think that that's really important. So that's the benefit that I think this book brings, and why I was so happy to support it. I am very careful in this space because I think there are people who sometimes know what they're doing and sometimes they don't, and they can do damage. And I think this book is the opposite of that. I think it's really constructive, and I think it's really helpful and practical. A practical way for us to have those conversations with our children when we ourselves need a crutch, if there's,
That's right, yeah.
I like metaphors and analogies, to help us have that conversation and to take us there.
That's right.
In a safe way.
It's hard to process something that is not talked about, like in the example of the woman that you mentioned. How could she possibly integrate that loss into her life if it isn't even acknowledged as anything in the first place?
I think there was a lot of fear. I think from I don't want to speak on her behalf, but I think that she was really scared because she was like, my mum is like, had a baby, and like, where's the baby now? Like there was literally, it wasn't even that there was a metaphor or an analogy, there was literally just nothing.
Yeah.
And it was like, did the baby get stolen? Did the baby, she just, and I think that she's still processing, I think a lot of that fear, but also I think I got the sense a little bit of resentment that she was left alone with that, and it was never explained to her.
Yeah. And also, children are very sort of self-absorbed, aren't they, Corey? They in their world, everything is about them, isn't it? I mean, when they cry, we come and comfort them. If they do a poo, we change their nappy. We had in the community consultation phase of writing this book, we invited parents to share their experiences and say what they think that the book should entail, what should be included, particular things that were difficult for them in their own journeys. And one mother wrote and said, we got my son to draw a picture to welcome the baby. as a welcome gift into the family, and then the mum came home without the baby. And obviously in his self-absorbed, 3-year-old or, under 4 age, the little baby, the boy said, "Where's the baby? Did it not like my picture?" So these are the sort of situations that the poor parent, what on earth are they supposed to say to that? And so that's, I think, where this book will come in helpful. And what do you say as a parent when you're, absorbed in your own grief? And so that's where it can be a communication aid. So
yes, absolutely. And I want to add to that too, that so oftentimes when I work with parents, that's one of the first questions that they ask is, what do I say? How do I say it? What do I not say? And I feel like a book like this helps to provide some of that language. It helps to scaffold that conversation for families.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I also see definitely scope for people who work with bereaved families to just have that consistency in language, like to know about the idea of, I love the idea of this book and how it is, like you said it really well, like just that whole idea about the house and the way it explains the feeling. It's just such a complex idea in such a simple way. And I think if we have all these health professionals who work with bereaved families in the early days, and I remember myself in hospital seeking advice of, what we're going to say to our 2.5-year-old. I mean, he was very young then when Isla was born. But we were looking for the language, what can we say, what shouldn't we say, da, da, da. It's very important to get the right advice and some helpful advice and good communication, and there's the end of the book has, like the back of the book has some really practical advice. Like it's just really, I feel it caters for a lot of different audiences,
and
which
parents,
I love.
Parents in that moment are also scared, aren't they, of saying the wrong thing and further traumatizing.
And it just gives some really gentle guidance. It's really, I think it caters for people who need a lot of visual. It has the words. It just has the package.
I think as well, I think that while people who work in this space actively go out and seek resources, which is part of, your practice. I think that I get asked a lot, my sister had a loss, what do I do, right? Like people ask me because I'm the miscarriage lady, which is fine, that's what I am. But, I get a lot of calls from people and on social media, people messaging me with my friend, my sister, my daughter, whatever. And I think that practical things like this that you can give someone and say, look, you're probably not ready for this, but when you are, I just want you to have it, because there may be a time that this will be helpful, and it's something that you can give to people that's like a practical thing that may assist them on their journey. So that's also, I think, really important, and that's where word of mouth is so important. That's why I always say to people, like, if you find a good resource, please tell people, because you never know when someone's going to need it. They don't know when they're going to need it, or either for themselves or to give it to someone else,
Yeah, that's right. And especially it's quite a close-knit community, this one. So good to know what resources there are. We have donated about over 500 copies of this book to maternity wards around Australia. But of course, those resources are going to be distributed to parents that are having a loss at the time in hospital, and not so much available for parents that have already been discharged from a facility. Do you think that there's any scope for this book to be used with children, or rather, if a family has had a loss and then they have a child afterwards?
I think so. I was, as you were talking, that's what came to my mind of worked with several clients who are adults now, but have had not integrated grief. So children who've been born after loss, but has never been talked about. And one of the clients actually said to me, "I feel like Jesus Christ." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" It's like I redeemed my mother. And so, for me, that's very powerful, because that becomes a script for how this client, this person lives their relationships, sees value in other relationships. And I often think, what would have happened if there was a resource like this back then? If mum could have addressed it, or dad could have addressed it, or grandpa, someone could have addressed this in a way that would help this person address this grief and integrate it in the best way they knew as a child, and then continue to grow up. Because as the child grows up and their developmental stages changes, their experience of grief changes. And so the same symptoms that, may have been there at 4 and 5 would change and maybe resurface at 9 and 10 when they're at a different stage and understand a bit more. And so something like this can prompt conversation at different stages for parents. So that's one element of it. The other element, I think, is when parents don't acknowledge their grief, they cannot be there for their child. It just cannot. This is a great resource, can maybe in some way prompt parents to sit with their grief. And so when they can sit with their grief, they can sit with their child in their grief, which in itself can help integrate grief as well.
Okay. Corey, what are the sort of like repercussions? We heard one example from Izzy, an anecdotal example. In your experience, in your practice, has there ever been a situation where you've had a patient that tells about their historical grief or something that wasn't talked about in their childhood, a loss that they then struggled with as an adult?
Not that specific example, but I can certainly think of many times when I worked with a pre-operational age child, 3, 4-ish, and then I worked with them again when they were 8, 9, 10, and the way that they come back to a deeper understanding of that loss. Absolutely. In my field in child life and grief counseling here in the United States, we call it re-grieving, which isn't entirely accurate because it's not like they've stopped grieving, but they definitely revisit the grief with new developmental understandings. There was one 7-year-old I was working with whose sibling died when she was about 3. And in her words, she said, "It hit me. I understood that he was never coming back when in their class, they were watching a movie and a dog died in the movie." And for whatever reason, in that setting, with that film, with where she was at in her developmental process, that was the first time that she realized, oh, he's never coming back.
Wow.
Yeah, I can actually, out of experience, speak on that too. I've got my son who was 2.5 when my daughter Isla died is now 11, and we have very different conversations now. And not too long ago, he said as well, I think I'll be a very different person if I would have a sister. Like, it was a really, probably wasn't, but it was literally, he had a moment, I know he went to a mate who had he has a sister, and they had like an argument or something. And he just came home and we were chatting about it. I said, "Mum, I wonder like who I would be if I would have a sister instead of my other 2. Like, he does a lot of complaining about the other 2, so he does a lot of reflecting about wondering what it would be like. And I've always braced myself for this question, and he would say, would you have had those other 2 boys if Isla would have lived? So these are all this thinking he's now, like, that would have obviously not come up a couple of years ago, but these questions come now. And it's just, just emphasising really what we've just heard, like, it's just so true, and I can...
There's, like, I don't think you can underestimate, like, just because a kid doesn't talk about something or doesn't go on and on about it doesn't mean that they're not thinking about it. And, I had a similar thing with my son. He's now 8, but he had a vanishing twin, which is where where you're pregnant with twins at a very early gestation. One twin suffers fetal demise, and you end up with one baby in the womb. And for a variety of reasons, I decided to tell him that, to help him understand, the breadth of, and also because I was speaking about it publicly, I didn't want him to hear it from anyone else other than me. And now, even now, when he meets a set of twins, whether he new class at school or whatever, he'll always say, I wonder what life would have been like if I'd had a twin. And I have ways to deal with that, which I won't go into. That I have a strategy for that, which we talk about a lot. But there's only one other thing that I kind of wanted to mention, which is that when we talk, or I'll speak for me, when I talk about, things that I would have done differently or optimal ways that parents can deal with these issues, there's no judgment. Like, it's really important just to say that really specifically, because you can't judge someone when they're not, no one's making clear decisions, and also parenting is a learning curve at the best of times. God knows, I have no idea what I'm doing most of the time, let alone when I'm also grieving. So I just wanted to emphasise, if there is anyone in the room, like, don't feel like there is no judgment. There's no right or wrong. There's a great hindsight's 20/20, like, there's a great ability to look back and go, oh, you should do it like this, you should do it like that. But there were no rules when I was doing it. I was just muddling my way through and trying to survive, and hopefully, for my son to survive, and my husband as well, because there was a lot of grief on that. So, so anyway, I just wanted to emphasise that, for anyone in the room. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking also when we're talking about how else this book could be useful, I can also picture this book being very useful for people who might not have a living child. And in the very early days, I remember I connected very much to children books on grief. I have, and I still do, but I remember that very vividly, and because it's just the way, and this book feeds into that as well. But it's a gentle way of explaining things. It gives words to maybe your feelings you don't even have yourself. It's ways how you can communicate it to others. So, and maybe you don't have a living child now, but you might or might not have one in the future. Again, you can then use that knowledge. Like because I think we haven't said that. I think that's another, because I was just reflecting on my own journey, and children books have always helped me in the early days and so on. That will definitely be another.
That's great to hear. We'll open the floor to some audience questions if anybody would like to ask anything or say anything to the panelists. You're very welcome to. Don't be shy.
Well, we can keep chatting and
Has anybody read the book?
Not
Yeah?
yet, yeah.
What are your thoughts? Go ahead.
One step back before Alison always telling me, thank you so much. I'm a midwife, and I've been a midwife for a very long time, and so I'm often with women, families, partnerships when they first experience the news or the confirmation of a loss. And one of the things that my mind comes back to often is the cliche, and I know it's quite a soft and light statement, but the cliche of not discussing a pregnancy until the hallmark of 12 weeks and so over the last 5 years, with some changes in how some families choose to do medical screening in early pregnancy, that hallmark of 12 weeks has now become 10 and a half weeks and thereabouts, and asking women to reflect before there is any level of medical investigation or surveillance or screening if chosen to do so. But actually asking women how, arriving at this moment of pregnancy, how do you feel, and who knows that you are experiencing these feelings, these thoughts, and this experience? And 90% of women that I meet, and I meet a lot of women, say, oh no, I don't have feelings about that yet, because I'm not really pregnant yet, because I'm not at that point. And that point, I think they're trying to pinpoint me to the medical moment of confirmation of pregnancy, or the first phone call that says, I think I'm pregnant, but I won't know until my GP tells me. And the point to me saying that is, as long as we've got this really stagnant, fixed statement on, you can't be pregnant, therefore you can't really engage in the thought processes, or you can't outwardly engage in the thought processes of pregnancy and your hopes and your desires until the medical world tells you, confirms that you are pregnant. And so I'm still seeing so many women that will be able to articulate some statistic around loss of pregnancy, miscarriage, death, but they're saying it. They're not supported by a group and a family and that lets them or allows them to sit in that, because we keep saying until this medical moment, until this person confirms, until there's an external source that says now is the time where you can be pregnant, therefore if there is loss after that, then you can grieve. But before that, there is not.
Yeah, would anybody like to respond to that? Is often a situation, isn't it, that people who haven't disclosed yet, quote unquote, their pregnancy, and then they tell people, oh, there's been a loss. People sort of go, oh, well, you've told me that there was a baby, now there isn't, in the same sentence. I don't know what to say now. Do I
Shall
say?
I feel it's early, yeah.
I feel like this is my...
Yeah, I feel
So-
it too, because you haven't, yeah.
I don't know how to answer this in a concise way because I wrote a whole book about this. So I'm like, oh, how much do I say and where do I go? So I think that it's really, oh gosh, like there's so, like I have so much I want to say right now and I'm trying really hard to distill it into answering this question. So there's through history, don't worry, I'm not going to go back through history, but through history, there have been a lot of different hallmarks of when you're really pregnant, okay? So like, there was a period when it was the quickening. So when you could actually feel the baby, that was when it was ensouled. So before that, no baby. Now, baby, right? So this, at the moment, we're living, in more recent history, it's been 12 weeks. When you get to 12 weeks, then you can tell people, right, that you're pregnant and then you're allowed to grieve. And what's happened is that with the advent of high sensitivity pregnancy tests and things like that, people know, like I know when I'm not going to have any more children, but when I was trying to have a family, I knew when I was pregnant 2 days after my period was due because I had super high sensitivity pregnancy tests at home. So I could even identify and therefore mourn a chemical pregnancy, which is not even at the, not even at the 6-week mark, for instance, right? So this is like really, really early. And so we have a tension here. We have people who know they're pregnant from 2 days after their period, who are sort of like, well, am I really pregnant? Am I not really pregnant? And this 12-week mark is, as you sort of hinted, really a misnomer because a lot of people are having a NIPT, which would identify genetic anomalies and things like that at 10 weeks or whatever. And often they'll have it at, say, 11 weeks, and then they find out at 12 weeks, 2 days after they've told everyone that they're pregnant, that they actually are more likely to be having a termination for medical reasons or whatever. Like there are lots of different... So this is where we get into like a really murky area of... does that person feel grief? And if they do, how do we allow them to express it? But also, there are parents, people with uteruses, who find out they're pregnant 2 days after their period is due. They already have a child. They're very distracted. They haven't connected with that pregnancy, and they don't feel any grief at all when that pregnancy doesn't result in an ongoing pregnancy, right? I'm using the word pregnancy a lot, but you get what I'm saying. So how do we not put grief on them too? Because if they don't feel any grief, great, like that's half your luck, okay? But so I think that I get asked a lot, when do you tell people you're pregnant? Like, what are the new rules? And it's choice. This is where we get women's health. We need to start recentering on choice. If you want to tell someone you're pregnant 2 days after your period was due, go for it. That is absolutely your entitlement, right? If you want to tell someone you're pregnant at 12 weeks, that's your entitlement too. It is about you and what you feel. From the people that I've spoken to anecdotally, a lot of people who have told their peers that they're pregnant at 10 weeks and then experience a loss are actually in some ways grateful because they therefore have a circle around them. Some people are not happy because they have to then tell the people that they've told they're pregnant that they're no longer pregnant. There's no one size fits all. My mum was very traditional. She was not happy when I was telling people that I was pregnant before 12 weeks. But I made the decision that despite the fact that I was clearly having recurrent miscarriage, that I would celebrate every pregnancy for as long as it lasted. If that meant that I was pregnant for 10 weeks, that's what I was going to celebrate. And for those 10 weeks, I was going to just lose myself in the potential of that life. And if it didn't end up resulting in a live birth, okay, I'll cross that bridge. That was the decision I made. She was not happy, right? It's about the patient or the parent. It's about what they want. It's about what they choose. I also spoke to a woman, I said, who had never told anyone about her miscarriage. And I said, well, why did you not tell anyone? No, not interrogating, just asking, like, to explain to me why you didn't tell anyone. And she said, because I opened my mouth and no words came out. Okay, everyone, I open my mouth and words can't stop coming out, right? Everyone is different, and we have to stop with this one size fits all thing. And that's why I see this book as something that you can use the way and when you want. It opens a conversation, which some people, they open their mouth, no words come out. This is where this can help you when no words will come out, but you want to talk about it. What direction you go in is entirely your decision, and the words you use after that, after these words have so generously been given to us to use, that's your decision. But I don't like this idea that we have to choose anything for anyone. We just have to empower every birthing parent to make the decision that's right for them, and then be comfortable with that decision. That's where the key is. Does that help? I don't know. It's a terrible, it depends sort of answer, but that's where I landed. Yeah.
I totally, in all of those points, I absolutely agree. Coming back to, it is the woman's choice. How you experience this and how you tell the story of your pregnancy is your choice.
Yeah. But how you experience grief, or if you don't experience grief, equally your choice. But
the idea is about legitimising all the feelings, right?
Yeah, but also legitimising the people who don't have those feelings in the early pregnancy space, because there are some people who, for various reasons, haven't connected. It may be that their parent had losses and they've been taught from a very early age, not all pregnancies result in a baby, and they know this and they are able to put a wall down. That's personal. Like, it's not everyone experiences grief, but those who do should be able to own it and express it, and we should be comfortable with that.
Yeah, have a society that supports them in that. Has anybody... Go ahead.
I just wanted to, because he said society, like, it just really comes down to, like, in this really tricky, I think in these times where I think awareness is raising in this area, so that should help the whole situation in the future to come, so people will maybe feel more safe to make whatever choices they're going to make, and we will be less judgmental over it. But we're not there right yet, so we see all that still happening. So all we can do is empower is a big word, like trying to educate, trying for society to understand these things are happening. We experience them all differently, and people make different choices. But I mean, we haven't even, pregnancy after loss, people will again make really different choices about another pregnancy when they might want to. For whatever reasons, it is also individual. So we can just be trying to be curious and be able to hold space for whatever they're choosing to do, and be, but which first of all is being non-judgmental.
And empower is a great word. I'm going to correct you and say
I
you
love
did choose the right word.
It's a good word.
And you need to empower not just the patients, but all the people around them to support them and feel empowered to do that.
That's right. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions?
Holding space element of it, right? Because you can only empower when you make space for it. And so if we don't, if we are not holding space, then there is, because if someone comes and talks to me and I'm going, oh, it's making me really sad, I don't want to talk about it, but at least really annoys me. And then,
That's a whole chapter onto itself.
oh, it really gets the amount of times I'm like, not at least. But it's that, because that's empowerment. When you go, yes, I can feel differently from you. I would have grieved differently from you. I feel this differently from you. But hey, my way of dealing with it is as much valid as yours is. And let's make space for this.
That's right. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'd really love to thank our panel and our wonderful volunteers and all of you for being here today. Obviously, you can purchase the copies of the book at the entrance. And the prices are in the welcome brochures. And I'd just really like to thank all of you for your attention and for being here. You're welcome to chat to the panel, who will be available to speak with you after this.
And thanks also for all your work in this space. Like, I keep saying it, but thank you. You're amazing. Possum Portraits really deserves everyone's support, as does this book and our overseas guest.
Thank you, Corey. You can... Good night to you.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.